Boo.
So we're a couple minutes early, but I figured we can just chit-chat, give people a chance to get on.
Okay. Does that mean we're on now?
We should be live now.
Okay. So I have to stop saying bad things about all the people I don't like?
Correct.
Okay, fair.
But you can say bad things about the people I don't like.
Okay.
So you just switch over.
Oh, okay. That
Different
works.
list.
That works.
So we got started just a couple minutes early. Again, we should be live by this point. My name is Michael here at the RPG Academy podcast. My guest tonight is Jim McClure.
Of course. Yeah, we're going to do this whole GM masterclass talking thing, and we're like visual and on camera and all of that, and it's funny because everyone that I have a ton of meetings that I do with other game designers and other projects and all that online on Skype and all that, and I never turn my camera on. They always call me the faceless void, and I go, well, yeah, I'm a podcaster. It's what I do. Like,
I'm the Silent King. You're the Invisible King.
the Silent King. Yes, that's right. I forgot about that.
I think we'll go like that for Halloween one year.
Silent King?
The
Okay.
Silent King. So yeah, we're gonna basically, this is our season 1 finale for the first season of GM Masterclass. We did the first series of the L5R game that we did on One Shot.
Yeah.
And we're gonna talk. I mean, we have some questions that were already sent in that we're going to address. I'm hoping we have some live viewers who might ask them questions live, and we can address those as well. We were afraid we would talk a long time.
We did.
Because there's a history of that happening.
There is.
So we started a little early. We started at 8 instead of our regular 9 o'clock, which that might be why. I don't know if people will join because this is an hour earlier than usual. Well, we have New York Tater has joined. Mickey McKenzie. They're watching us on Periscope. I still haven't figured out how this works on Periscope.
I might as well be a Luddite at this time. I don't know what Periscope is. I know it's something people do, and I go, is this a Snapchat thing? I don't know.
It's a social media video chat program, but it's like basically like a presentation. There's not like a lot of interaction.
Okay.
But so I don't know if they're even able to ask questions.
Well, hopefully.
I don't know how that works.
Just yell it into your Periscope device really loudly.
Really, really loud.
I'm turning into a grandpa with a walker. Back in my day, it was just podcasts.
Or you could tweet at us at the RPG Academy or at GM Jim McClure. I'll have my phone on, so we'll go from there. So it looks like we got a couple people so far. Hopefully a few more people will join us. But so let's just do some high-level recap.
Yeah.
So in case someone happens to watch or listen to this having not gone through anything before, including our series or the original series.
That'd be a bold choice.
I would question that. What was the first, like, give us the 5-minute IMDb summary of L5R Part 1.
Okay, so what we essentially you want the overview of this thing. This is where we're podcasters because you didn't get to edit out the dumb questions that get asked back.
We can't edit.
I know it's live. It's weird. So yeah, essentially what happened within our story is we had 3 players. We had Michael, Caleb, and James D'Amato, who came and played Legend of Five Rings, and it was a podcast series. It aired in, was it 4 or 5 episodes, whatever it was, on the One Shot Podcast Network. And essentially the story that was played through was these 3 samurai were chosen to come to a village where there was a land dispute between 2 clans, the Spider Clan and the Spider Clan and the Crab Clan. And they showed up, and essentially the land dispute was the river had moved and the borders had originally been drawn on the river, so there was dispute as far as who owned that territory. It was essentially an excuse to have our people be angry at each other.
Setup.
It was the setup, exactly. And you 3 were there to essentially make the decision on where the land should be. And then as you got involved into it, you realized there was a whole bunch of political connotations to this, and everyone got mixed up in a whole bunch of fun, bad nonsense. Ultimately, you all went up to the river, found that it had been dammed by some Oni that had been summoned. You pinned Daigotsu Jin, who was the leader of the Spider Clan, as the person responsible for it. But yet, because of what we did, which was called a dual stacking plot, it became difficult to go like, yeah, let's just kill that dude, and instead built up to a very climactic moment where ultimately we had a duel between James D'Amato's character and Daigotsu Jin. James D'Amato's character won, Daigotsu Jin backed off, but yet there was still implications for a part 2.
Yeah, there was some tension.
A little bit of tension.
Yeah,
delicious tension.
So New York Tater says, actually, yes, this is the first of the series that he has watched or listened to.
Bold
choice, Cotton. Let's see how that works out for you. So the concept of the GM Masterclass is, so this was a game that Jim ran. This was a game that I played in, and we essentially did like a director's commentary. So we listened to the audio of that original series with James's and the One Shot permission, and you as the audience could hear it as well our feed. And then when something happened that we thought was interesting or relevant to what we were trying to do, which is give GM advice, we would stop that audio and we would talk about it, and sometimes in length.
In a lot of length. A lot of length.
And then we would go back and, continue on. And there's a few times where we would just talk over the audio, more like an actual director's commentary. But I've had people even say that, I think I did a pretty good job with the audio levels, but the fact that two of the people in the show were also two people on the original, it did sometimes make it hard to know what was going on. But the idea was to give GMing advice not in a vacuum. Because in a lot of the shows that I listen to, and a lot of the shows that we do, we give theory. Like, this is what you could do, or this is what we have done in the past, but it's not always a concrete example of, okay, right there, listen, that's why I used that word, or that's why I asked you to roll right then, or that's why I did this. And I think it gives a little bit more concrete examples to go from. So, it's something we would talk about doing for a long time. I'm glad we finally got to do it. And I would say really the only negative feedback we got was one person wasn't a huge fan of the original AP, and they would have preferred us to just do the context, like not have the actual whole audio, but like pull out the moments that we were talking about and just link them together without having the whole audio, which we talked about doing that, but it was way too hard.
Yeah,
it's gonna take way too long.
And that's what I was gonna throw that question. That question goes to the producer.
Yes.
To be concerned about it. But I remember I think we did talk a little bit about that at the beginning, because when we first talked about doing the series before anything was recorded, I started re-listening to the series just to refresh myself with sort of what happened on it. And I listened to that first episode and I was like, okay, I'm just gonna write down a timestamp when there's something I want to talk about. And as I was listening in the car, and totally not writing on a pad of paper,
while driving,
we'll just ignore that. I looked down and I was like, oh, in the first hour, I have 14 things that I want to stop and talk about. It's like, oh, this may be a difficult thing to do, but I can certainly understand, not wanting to necessarily sit through all of it. But at the end of the day, a production decision was made, and at least I personally thought it turned out decent. Hopefully, and we got a lot of good feedback from it.
I do as well. And again, I had that exact conversation, and there were a couple of our alpha listeners from our patrons and the faculty within the network. I sent early episodes too, like, hey, listen to this, I want some feedback. And because that was my exact concern. But I was evaluating like what I would have to leave in versus what I would have to cut out. And I'm sure there's stuff that could have been cut, but there's also so much context that was needed that I might have to leave in a lot here and a little there. I just don't know that it was worth that much time and effort when it's a great series to listen to anyways.
Yeah. And part of that is, of course, my wonderful nonsense too, which is I context matters so much. I think that's one of the advantages of doing this the way that essentially you did it, Michael, on it was there's so many things, especially within this series and my personal GM style and many people's GM style, where one thing builds to another. And if you don't get that building, if you don't get the raising and lowering of tension, if you don't feel all of that, you're not getting the impact and not necessarily being able to see why the scene impacted the way that it did. So I really like that it was in there. I personally did. But that's your decision. I'm through it now. I'm done. Yeah. I'm out of the basement.
Well, you're back in it now.
I know.
I'm happy with how it turned out. I don't anticipate changing it. In the future we may look at doing it differently, but I was happy with how it worked, and we'll go from there. Quickly, New York Tater did notice. I did shave actually today. I look fresh and clean.
I did too.
I've been scruffying for a while now. I didn't get in trouble at work. No one seems to care. I just got tired of it, and it'll start over tomorrow because I have a lazy beard. Like, I don't really want a beard. I just hate shaving. So I'll shave once. I'll let it grow for like 3 weeks until I look like a homeless person. And then I shave it off and it starts all over.
I can't do it. Got to be clean shaven.
So until we get some new questions, let's go ahead and go to the ones that were sent. I think I included you on that email.
Yeah.
So let me... Should have had this.
You want me to ask the question to myself?
Give me a second. I'll get it. Entertain the people.
Entertain the people. I wish I could like juggle or something like that. I don't have juggle. I got story and game theory. It's all I got, man.
I can actually juggle a little bit.
Can you really?
Yeah.
I've tried so hard. I
mean, I'm terrible at it. I'll drop like every 7 seconds, but I can get the motion. And
I'm fairly well coordinated. We've talked about this. I've done martial arts since I was 12 years old regularly, and juggling perplexes my mind and body to a way. I'm sure there's just like once it clicks, but man, I have tried and just can't do it. Ah, yes. Yes, yes,
All
yes.
right, so here we go.
All right.
Excuse me. And I do apologize that some of these I didn't write who asked them. I wanted to include that, so you can blame me for that. So one of the things we talked about in the show overall is that you are passionately focused on the 3-act structure. You think that it's an important element to telling certain types of stories. So the question here is, how does this translate to a campaign versus this being a one-shot? So a one-shot makes sense. You got, the setup, the trouble, and then the conclusion. But if you're going to have a 4, 5, 6 episode series, or again, a campaign that may last years, how do you work the 3-act structure into a longer story?
And that's a really good question, and I immediately wanted to answer the question about my belief with the 3-act structure theory, so we'll just save that for whenever it comes up again. So as far as directly to the question asked, it's an interesting thing to understand and to play with. The 3-act structure within a tabletop game, to me, plays out a lot slower than what you would normally experience in other forms of media. It plays out slower than what you would experience in a television show, in a movie, or in a podcast. We got through it, honestly, really quickly in a 5-hour time frame. My typical, when I'm running a game for like a home group, a standard, if there is a standard tabletop way to play, what I'm looking for is I pretty much run a 3-act structure typically in about 4 to 6 play sessions. So anywhere from 16 to 24 hours-ish of playtime is how long it typically takes me to run through a 3-act structure. And then how I do a campaign, it's funny you should ask, because we get to see this live whenever I come back for part 2 of the GM Masterclass, is I do it exactly like what we did with this L5R series, which was the first series was a 3-act structure story. Then it was done. It was complete. There was threads that we could go forward or we could stop there. And we decided to continue and go forward with it with the L5R series, and we did part 2, which is another 3-act structure story. And there's threads that could go forward, and maybe, who knows, if the podcast gods align themselves just right, a part 3 might show up at some point in time. But that's how I do it for a campaign. I don't try and take a 3-act structure and go, I am going to run this over 30 play sessions, because the problem that you're going to run into is people have a very subconscious understanding of story and how story structure works. And the reason we have that is because we're bombarded with it all the time. Every movie, every TV show, every novel, everything that you've ever read, every bit of entertainment you've ever engaged with, good entertainment, has some sort of narrative structure to it. So you understand kind of what to expect. And one of the big things that people expect, and this should be a surprise to no one, is a finale. They want that finale moment. They want that release of tension. They want that, the end of the duel from this series. It's like, yes, we did the thing.
Yes.
It's good. And we're done. And we get that sense of finale, and that re-energizes narrative, and it re-energizes the listeners, who are also the story creators in tabletop, for the next portion of it. If you do not allow that moment to happen, at some point the mind just becomes exhausted, and it's just, okay, it's more information. I get it. The Lich is bad. I just want to kill him. And if you do try and stretch out the 3-act structure too long, you don't get that sense of finale, that sense of accomplishment to it. So again, my core advice for running a 3-act structure in a campaign style play is you run multiple 3-act structures that connect to each other. And my personal preference, again, you can do them fast, you can do them slow, but my personal preference is I go at a home game for about every 4 to 6 play sessions.
Yeah, and I think trying to decipher that into Michael speak, because I need Caleb, because then Caleb can translate it from Michael into human speech, is that you can still follow the 3-act structure within an ongoing game for particular like arcs. So you're in a game and then you introduce a new complication. The Lich has arisen, blah blah blah. There could be a 3-act structure within dealing with the Lich. The Lich is now dead. Campaign's not over.
Right.
So now there's a new complication. It could be the power vacuum created by the Lich being destroyed. Could be have nothing to do with that whatsoever. It's a new enemy rising in the west, or army coming across the sea, or whatever. Or it could be a smaller personal story about one of your siblings died in the game and you have to go to the funeral. Those types of things. So you just you do multiple 3-act structures, and I think you could get. I don't want to get too complex, but you could have them interweave in a way where you might have like a setup and then like 2 middle parts because 2 stories are combining or commingling, and then have separate resolutions that just kind of crisscross together. Whether that's done on purpose or because your players just don't follow what you think they'll do, that could be an interesting and complex story to tell.
Yeah, and just to give one other piece of advice in that regards too, maybe advice, maybe personal preference. I try not to plan out my arcs in advance. In that I plan out the arc that we're going to do, and then I want to see how it progresses. I want to see how ultimately that resolves. As we talked about, for those that listen to and follow through the GM Masterclass series, we know when we sat down at the table to play, Michael, your character's daughter was not sister was not a character that existed in the world. That happened about an hour and a half into it when I needed a lever to pull. Again, she just didn't exist,
yeah.
And yet the entire next arc is predicated on that. So what I do is I look at, okay, we did the arc, we did my 4 to 6 play sessions, whatever the case may be. I did my 3-act structure, and then I go, okay, what were the players most engaged with that wasn't resolved? That's my hook for the next one.
Mm-hmm.
And I try never to resolve everything, because stories don't end. They just always perpetuate themselves forward. That's what Vince McMahon in the WWE has taught me, right? Always forward.
Yeah. So New York Tater asked, not including podcast situations, but just quote-unquote regular games.
Regular games.
What is your average play session? When your group gets together, are you playing for 2 hours, for 8 hours?
I like 4 hours. I really like 4 hours, and I guess it's kind of the de facto standard. I don't know that everyone talks about it like it is, but the reason I like 4 hours is because there's a certain rise and fall of attention that happens within a group, and 4 hours for me in my experience seems to be good, because people kind of get like the first 30 minutes. You're getting in, you're getting settled in, you're eating your chips, you're drinking water, you're doing whatever it is that you're doing, and you're still kind of joking around, and you're not fully in world. You're not in the magic circle yet, as we call it. And then we get in the magic circle, and then that's when the good role play starts happening, and people start getting involved. They start getting engaged with it, and you start to feel it. And then there becomes this mid-session lull, just as energy goes down a little bit, typically, and I plan a lot for that lull. I want to see it happen, and then people will pick back up sort of for an end-of-session finale as the energy comes back with whatever dramatic things that are happening. So I found that I like the 4-hour session because I sort of hit that pattern more often than I don't hit that pattern, and it's a very predictable, good pattern that seems to occur. So I like it for that. Typically, I've found sometimes if I cut it off shorter than that, all of a sudden we get down in that lull valley, and then we just stop, and it's like, so that's a lot of really crazy high-level advice for how long do you play a game, I suppose, but that is my rationale. And again, my typical is a 4-hour, when I'm playing, I'm going to say a traditional role-playing game, with reference to, of course, cheap plug, Reflections was the game that I designed that plays in an hour, which is its own thing.
So I think, again, Michael, speak for that, is you want to leave not wanting to leave,
right?
Or what's George Costanza, always leave them wanting more.
Yep.
You want to leave in a port where people are like, oh no, I want to know, they want to come back next session. So you need to have enough time to get to that. And if you're playing a game that has a lot of role play, you need some flexibility, because this section might take longer, that section may not take as long. I'm the same way. Like at this point, I usually play about 4 hours, but we actually get about 3 actual playing hours in, because we're goofing around and you know, all that kind of good stuff. And that works well for me in my current lifestyle with the wife and the kids and the job and blah 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 blah. It's also easy for me to prep in that time frame, because I'm very light prep. I do almost no prep these days. I do prep beforehand, but not before each game. It's a long story. But I can usually just make stuff up for about 3 hours. And then I start getting to the point where, like, okay, before I make any other big decisions, I need to think about what happened so that I can make sure it all makes sense and connect it together. So for me, it's about 3 to 4 hours. Now, in my youth, we'd play 16, 18 hours. We'd basically fall asleep, wake back up, keep playing, go to Taco Bell, come back, keep playing.
See,
Can't do that.
I miss those, because, well, I shouldn't say I miss those. I miss that I missed those, because I didn't get into tabletop until I was 21. So, and at that point, like, I've been an old man since pretty much the day I was born. That's all I actually wanted to be when I grew up, was I always wanted to be an old man. But
congratulations.
Thank you. But
you achieved the dream.
I never got to do those with with the exception of, oh, this is a joke I'm going to tell. Okay, this is a good one. Because we do this thing now every year. This year, the second year we did it. We actually just did it last weekend. We call it a cabin con, which you're going to recognize this, aside from the fact that it's a ripoff of a catacon.
Yeah.
But I feel like it started when me and you had a conversation about this, that we were going to do a rogue catacon and just rent a cabin out and do a cabin con.
Yeah.
And me and my friends now do that, where we just go for a weekend and we do one continuous story just all weekend, all night, all day. First year we did Shadow of the Demon Lord. This year we actually did D&D 4th edition, because we were like, oh, we could get like at least 3 combats in, because we have a whole weekend.
You got the whole weekend. Yeah, I mean, I think that just, it sounds so good.
Yeah.
I don't know that I would want to do the one whole story, because we do our faculty retreat,
Yeah.
which is coming up in 2 weeks. I'm very excited about that. And it's basically just a small, gamers weekend just for the people associated with the podcast. But it's great just to be sort of like secluded, because I actually drive for that one. We drive like 5 hours away. I don't know anybody other than the people I'm there with. We have food ordered in, and we just play games. And as long as you can sit until your butt hurts and you stand up, walk around, and you come back and play some more. But yeah,
good times.
I don't have the stamina to do that anymore a lot. Like, it would just drive me. I would be gray haired.
All right, what else we got, Michael?
All right, so we got another question here. And again, for anyone who's in chat, please, we want to take live questions. So if you have a question about the GM Masterclass, the L5R system, or the game we played, session, I should say, or just anything GM related, or even facial hair related, feel free to ask. We'll do our best to address it. So this was an interesting question. I think this came from Tanner, who's actually Shadow of the Cabal podcast. He's in the network.
Got a funny story about that one, too.
Yeah. So one of the things about the L5R setting is it's a fantasy version. It's a romanticized version of Asian culture.
Mm-hmm.
And typically Asian culture isn't necessarily pro-feminine,
Mm-hmm.
but within the L5R it is. You can have, females of power. I think in our game, the Empress was a female. But Tanner noticed that there weren't any prominent female NPCs in this game, other than my sister, who again really was used as a tool. So was that a conscious decision, or was it a sort of just didn't come up situation? Or so why were there no women in this game that were important?
That is a very legitimate question to ask, and it is okay. Everyone listening, bear with me here for a moment, okay?
Drink your water. Also, tonight I have my Princess Pony.
It's My Little Pony.
My Little Pony.
And you've got Pinkie Pie on the front, who is the correct one, because Pinkie Pie, best pony.
Perfect.
Yes. We're learning more and more about Jim. So
Yes.
Speaking of wonderful reveals that are about to have, so a little bit about me and a little bit about the situation to explain why this was the way it was. And as we talked about throughout this whole series, we're going to be as open and honest.
Yep.
This is the time.
There's no point in doing it if we're not going to be honest.
Exactly. So this was the first ever real podcast that I had done, other than this little bit of stuff with this other group called the RPG Academy. I had done almost nothing in the public view for it. So this was kind of the first thing like that I had ever done. And I knew I listened to One Shot, and I knew, based on listening to them, obviously the political beliefs and the beliefs that they uphold for it. A secret about Jim McClure, perhaps, is that I do not have the same political affiliations as probably the majority of people listening to this. It's been interesting, actually, over the last 3 years, sort of meeting them and then getting more involved with the space and learning more about gaming culture and the community and the people within the community. And I knew that things like, as weird as this is to say, and we're being open and honest here, things like gender equality, things like racial equality were things that were important to be displayed. And I've always believed that. But I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know what the rules are. There aren't rules, but I didn't know what was appropriate and what wasn't appropriate. Originally in the game, actually, the weak crab who was tainted on that, that was originally supposed to be a female. Likewise, the crab samurai who confronted James about who had did the Sadane game, that was supposed to be a female in the original plan of it. And I guess I'm going to say I chickened out about an hour before, because I literally I don't know if it's going to be inappropriate for me as a white male to come on and represent females. I legitimately didn't know. And I was like, I'm just not going to touch it, because I don't know where that line gets drawn. looking back at 3-year past Jim, I realize how silly that is. And now I have evolved and developed my beliefs in that regard, and understand. And of course, you see it in the second series. Obviously, the Imperial who was there, mild spoilers, who sort of presides over part of the trial. We have several strong, prominent female characters, and then of course, obviously, in this original game, Kat was supposed to be part of it, and presumably, I believe she was going to play a female character. But that's the reason. Is it was originally planned. I kind of look at characters and feel, as far as what seems appropriate to the character on it. And again, there were supposed to be a couple in there, and in about an hour before I went, I don't know what the rules are because this is my first stepping into this environment. I'm just not going to tread on them. And again, looking back at 3-year-old Jim, I went, that's the exact wrong thing to do. But that was the reason.
But I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but I can totally understand that with someone who also, we have a podcast that promotes inclusivity. We want anyone and everyone to play games. But just by the way it's worked, almost everyone in the RPG Academy core, white dudes. So we want to represent, but we also don't want to do it in a way that is not the intent. So we do it poorly, and then we end up doing worse than if we had done nothing. So I get that. My games, I try as often as possible to have females in interesting in positions of power. I'm not good at voices, so I just use my voice and I say it's a girl or it's a dude or it's whatever. But yeah, if you're trying too hard, I could see where that would be. You got enough on your plate. So fair question by Tanner.
Absolutely.
It's a legitimate question, but I also think that's a legitimate answer to
Absolutely.
what's going on. All right. So once again, to anyone in chat, if you have any questions, please throw them out. Otherwise, we'll just keep going through the ones that we have already. Excuse me. So this one comes from Calum, who's on the Released podcast, which is also a member of the RPG Academy Network. And he says that he feels that the GM Masterclass is a show more relevant to advanced game masters, which is fine because there's so much of the information out there aimed at new players and new GMs. But his question is, do you remember a specific game or session where, in hindsight, was sort of the aha moment of, I've leveled up, I am now an advanced GM, or maybe even not that level, but just you felt my skills have improved?
Let me tell you the story of Agasha Funakoshi.
Okay.
I do. I mean, the long and short is I do have that moment. I will say it wasn't a hindsight moment to me. I kind of recognized the moment when it happened, and God, I'm gonna hate telling the story because it's just gonna sound like I'm patting myself on the back for it. But this question set me up for it, so you get it. Sorry,
I'll throw you a softball. It's your job to hit it.
It's a gaming story. So this was my home L5R group, and essentially there was a moment where my first ever game that I ran was a D&D 4th edition game, and I did everything wrong. Everything wrong. You can pretty much call it. The first combat encounter was a whole bunch of powerful things that are way more powerful than the players because they're supposed to lose the match. Just everything wrong, right? So this was the first one where the game was going really well and I was building towards a thing, and I completely succeeded in hitting the exact moment that I wanted, and it's one of my most crystallized gaming moments. Is I built the villain of villains, Agasha Funakoshi. He was a Void Shugenja, for those familiar with the L5R setting. And the first, another, just as a GM advice, you want to make someone a villain, just arbitrarily mildly inconvenience the party. Because the first thing that he did, which immediately made the party hate them, he was traveling with them, is they were marching to a forest. It was a week-long march. And the second day, he was like, I'm tired, we stop now. And it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. These are arbitrary numbers that we're just throwing out in an arbitrary march. And they were seething angry at him just because he was lazy and didn't feel like continuing. And it just built up well from there. It got silly at times. He had a face-changing spell, and he ended up being disguised as one of the main characters' love interest, who he thought had died years prior to that, who had actually died years prior to that. They ended up getting married in a forced marriage situation where I was sweating bullets going, they're marrying the bad guy. They are literally unknowingly marrying the bad guy. But anyway, we got to, I don't need to go in too much longer. they got to the point where they realized he was the bad guy. He was causing all this crazy apocalyptic stuff. He was going to destroy the Celestial Dragon. It was a huge, insane plot. And they finally cornered him. And they were ready to attack, and they were done with his nonsense and ready to kill him. So our big warrior dude, Greg was playing, he first combat round, he shoots like 2 beams of light and separates off the 3 players, so they're each in like their own little column. And Greg attacks, massive damage, rolls 70+ damage on his double hits, just totally tears him apart. And what's happening is I'm only communicating with the other 2 players via note card, okay? And they are seeing that Greg, essentially, he's under the control of it's just an illusion spell, that he got off his horse, he walked, and his horse was a big part of the story. He walked halfway to Funakoshi, he turned around, walked back to his horse, and all the attack rolls were on the horse. And he finally realized, like, they were jumping and trying to stop him. He was seeing shadow forms, was just trying to knock them off. Eventually, he gets them off, realizes something's wrong, honor rolls, success, breaks the spell, sees what he's done. And it was that moment where he went, and the horse's name is Apple, is Apple dead? And I went, how much damage did you roll? And he went 70, whatever it was. And I go, how much HP does it have? And at that point, Agasha was gone. And there was 30 seconds of just silence at the table. And when they went up and finally got to kill him in the next scene, was just, it was the moment. I had built a villain. To this day they spit on the ground when we say Agasha Funakoshi, and it was what I had intended to do, and we got there and we hit it perfectly, and it was an incredibly emotional experience. That was the moment where I was like, okay, I think what I am doing and the principles that I'm working with work to tell interesting, good stories within the context of tabletop. So that's my long-winded table story for you all.
Excuse me. So I don't have a clear-cut answer for this myself, but I think what I would say is, because I've been running games for a very long time, but they were pretty bad for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was 12 when I started.
Right,
you know,
right.
And then I gamed all through high school and through college, but those were always still pretty much with the same people. And, you know, I can tell interesting stories, and I think I can create interesting characters and interesting situations, but I did a lot of things wrong. I did a lot of things that I would now say don't do, taking players' agency, you know, forcing them into situations just so I could get my effect, not what they want, yada, yada, yada. But there was enough interesting things happening, but the players are still, you know, on board with it, right? Mm-hmm. And it was when we started the podcast and we started doing the Made Men campaign, which was our first ever campaign that we ran for the show. And, you know, our show, you know, it started off the way most shows do. But when we got to the point where we started doing the actual plays, when we started getting an audience. So I became acutely aware that people were listening to the game. So I started thinking, like, I need to make this game fun for the audience. Mm-hmm. Here's a high-level trick for you. A game that's fun for the audience, also fun for the players.
Funny how that works.
And vice versa. If it's fun for the players, it'll be fun for the audience. So I focused more on just making it fun and more interesting and engaging. I wanted the characters to role play more. So I gave them a lot more opportunities to just talk to each other, and then I would build off of what they said. And then combined with that, I started recording the sessions. So I was editing, and I kept hearing myself. I listened to myself run games over and over and over again. And I started to pick up on things that I did that I didn't like, things I did that I thought were good. And just, they became more top of mind. I was like, okay, I remember I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. So I wouldn't do it as much. And then the things that I wanted to do, I would focus on more. And then the third thing would be just, I also got exposed to a lot more GM because I never went to conventions before. So the only people I ever played with were my group. I ran 90% of the time. Every now and then, like, one other person would run. So I started going to conventions, and, you know, I had dozens of people running games. Started listening to podcasts and had dozens of people I was listening to run the games. And I just started absorbing everything that I thought was good. And I think that Made Men, like, near the end of that game, everyone just was so invested in that story, and they were so excited about where it was going. And there was some weird stuff and time travel and blah, blah, blah. But the players really seemed to love it. The audience really seemed to like it. And I felt like, I'm pretty good at this.
There you go.
There we go.
There you go.
All right. So we had a question on the chat here from Moldy Noilds. God, I can't say that, which I believe is Jacob, part of the Redemption Podcast crew. And he was asking, do we have any tips or tricks for descriptive narration in session? Before a session and after a session, I always try to keep in the phrase, you know, be more descriptive, but in the game, it seems like I'll lose that.
On Okay, so there's some interesting. I assume it sounds like the question is essentially how to get if you are a GM, how to get your players to be more descriptive, or is the question more as a GM how to be more descriptive?
I read that as the GM when you're describing, like you walk into a room, like using multiple senses and just painting a good picture so the players and characters can kind of feel and see what's going on around them.
Yeah. I am such a big proponent of Stephen King in his book on writing. He actually talks about this as far as writing, essentially setting a scene for a person, and this is pretty much how I look at it, which is when I'm setting a scene for someone, what I want to describe is the 3 things that are most relevant to them at that moment. And I think if I can't remember now if this was Stephen King's example or someone else's example off of Stephen King's on writing, and you read enough of these and you start forgetting what is what, but they describe it of, okay, you have your main character walks into someone's living room to sit down and have a talk about to let them know that their brother died. What are the first 3 things that they notice in that? Now, that same person walks into that living room because he's chasing someone to try and kill him. What are the 3 things he notices in that situation? Because they're going to be entirely different things. When we're walking to sit down, I'm going to notice how fluffy the sofa is. I'm going to notice the sectional. I'm going to notice the disheveled papers that are sitting there. When I am running through chasing someone, I'm going to notice the glass doors that are on the back. I'm going to notice the low ceilings. I'm going to notice these different things. So one of the big things that I try to think about is staying in that mindset of the players of what are they in here to interact with. I almost don't have a need to provide them factual statistical data of there is a bookshelf behind you that has 23 assorted board games on it. What is relevant? Okay, if they're doing an investigation and we're playing Satanic Panic because it's the night of cheap plugs apparently, and they're looking for evil tabletoppers, 23 board games is now suddenly super relevant. If we are playing something entirely different and they are coming in here because they're again looking to kill someone, they don't probably care that he's got a couple board games on the shelf. So one of my big advice is pay attention to that, and if you describe the 3 things that are most relevant to the players in that situation, a lot of times that will give them the information they need to do the action they're trying to do.
All right. So from that same book, which is also my favorite book on writing, which is called On Writing, and I've read a lot of books on writing, less is more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That especially in an RPG, we have a shared imagination. And if I say, okay, you're walking into the tavern and it's a busy night and there's bustling around and there's a boisterous dwarf in the corner who's gambling and throwing dice, whatever, you kind of already have an idea of the other things. You've played D&D before. You've watched fantasy movies or read fantasy novels. So as long as I don't say something that's counter to what you're already picturing, it doesn't matter if we see the same things or not.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to use less descriptions and just rely on my players to fill in that themselves. And then again, I'm a very improv heavy GM. So if one of them says, well, I'm going to go jump up on the stage in the middle of the tavern, well, there might not have been a stage in the middle of the tavern in my head, but there is now because that doesn't change anything.
Right.
So if they think that's what it looks like, then it does, and we just roll with it. And then the other thing, again, I had it and it's gone. Oh God, what was I going to say? I use short verbal shortcuts like movie language. The camera follows this person. You have the art, the swipes and the cuts. So I use familiar language. Like it looks just like Winterfell, but with half orcs.
Right. Yep.
You know exactly what that looks like if you've watched Game of Thrones, and if you haven't, why are you listening to this podcast? So don't be afraid to take shortcuts with language and shared experiences. It's just like the scene in Lord of the Rings when Bilbo's talking to Gollum. It's in that cave with the dripping water and the stalactites. Right now, I can see in my mind that scene. That's all I got to describe. I don't need to describe there's the fish floating in the water or the slippery rocks behind you. You already filled that in. So as long as I don't invalidate that, then I don't need to give you everything. I just need to give you enough.
Exactly. Yeah. I heard it put once of I'm trying to put a picture in your mind. I'm not trying to put my picture into your mind. You're trying to inspire them and inspire the imagination for them to see it. Now, obviously, if something is core relevant, okay, yeah, that big bad guy you've been chasing for 6 months, he's sitting at the table in the corner. That's pretty relevant. Needs to be addressed to it. But beyond that, the little stuff, allow the imagination to run wild. The reality is that if your bar is broken into 3 rooms or 2 rooms, probably doesn't matter. And in my mind, for some reason, the bar is always this stone exterior thing, and it has one room off to the right. Every bar I've ever been in, that's been my picture until I've been told otherwise. And here's the clue. Half the time I've been told otherwise, I'm still picturing that same bar until it comes time to I want to burn it down or some nonsense.
Exactly.
Right. But yeah, it's putting a picture into their mind.
So, and I would further clarify, because this is one area that I still struggle with a lot too, is when you're in combat, trying to describe combat actions. Because in a lot of my games, the first few rounds, very descriptive. When we get kind of past that point, it's like, did you hit? Okay, did you hit? Okay, they're dead. So the longer it goes, the less descriptive I'm likely to be. So do you have any tips and tricks for combat specifically?
Combat is a little bit more difficult. And I seem to remember talking about podcast or combat on this series and having a retort written, but that's a different story. The thing about combat is once you get into many rounds of combat, you're ending up in a situation where their further description isn't helping, and that's why description peters out. It's okay, I'm in combat, I jump over the flaming cart and I swing and hit the guy with the sword, and yeah, I took out 40% of his health or whatever it is, and then the next swing I take out another 40% of his health, and now I guess I'm swinging again, and that one missed. Now just okay, and he's dead. And so it becomes a little bit more naturally difficult because you're essentially retrying to describe the same thing, which is, in a tense moment, I try to resolve this tension with steel. That's what you're doing. To then go, okay, next round, I am in a tense moment, and I'm going to try and resolve this tension with steel. I'm in a tense moment, and steel trying to resolve it. Steel to resolve. Like
missed.
Exactly.
Missed. You're dead.
And that's where you end up at. So to me, the big thing that keeps it interesting is there's a couple little things you can do.
Excuse me.
One, I almost always do this. You didn't hear it in the podcast, but in home games and most games I'm running, players hear me say this all the time, describe your kill. Anytime someone kills, it's a very simple thing to just throw it at them. They get to describe themselves as in a cool, heroic moment of like, oh yeah, I did this, and they, I cut him across the throat and he falls down, and I stab him down into the ground, through his heart, or whatever the case is. So that gives a little thing. The other thing that I really try and do, which is more of combat design than anything else, is I try to make the combat, if you make the combats more than about just killing everything in front of you. The situation that I use is, okay, we have that's right, I like to flip this. Okay, so we have a princess attacking a town to try and kidnap a dragon, okay? So what happens is the princess is giant, she's 50 feet tall, she's a fire-breathing princess, and she's coming to just wreck everything. And you are trying to save the dragon from getting kidnapped by the princess. If you directly fight the princess, you're probably gonna die, because the princess is like 4 levels higher than you, and breathes fire, and it's a solo monster. I've reskinned a dragon as a princess, right? So anyway, so what happens is we have a combat encounter where now it's a part, do I fight the princess? Do I try and save the dragon? Meanwhile, the town around them is crumbling as the princess is stomping around and destroying everything. So the innkeeper that I was, had a wonderful picnic with his daughter, suddenly he's trapped below flaming rubble, and also, the pirates have attacked that same part in the town, because this is apparently a crazy town. Now all of a sudden I have a combat encounter that is not about killing all of the things in front of me. It's about interacting with different pieces of a story that's going on, and that lends itself better to sort of continued description, because now I get to jump off a rooftop and attack the princess. I get to dive under, flaming rubble to save the shopkeeper. I get to do these different things which ignite the imagination in different ways. So one of the biggest ways that I found to do it sort of ties into a bigger discussion about encounter design, but it's going, if everything you're doing is just I swing and I hit, that is naturally going to peter out over multiple rounds. There's really no way to get around it. So try and do stuff to make it more engaging and dynamic.
Okay. So what I would add in there, and this is talking about D&D specifically.
Sure,
I'm sure it's relevant to other games as well, but one of the things that it's sort of a pet peeve for me is trying to explain to people what hit points are and what they're not, and what armor class is and what it's not. They are abstract representations. Once you understand that fully, and it's one thing to say I get it, but it's another thing to understand it fully, I believe, you can start to describe combats in a much more interesting way, because a hit means you did damage. Doesn't mean you actually hit them.
Mm-hmm.
So you could describe a hit as I swing my sword, but they duck. But when I hit the wall, it causes something to fall over, and a pot falls on their head. The math says you take 4 damage.
Right.
My narration can make that whatever I want it to be, as long as you don't get like stupid crazy, like Spider-Man shows up and shoots you with a web. Okay, but and then a miss can actually be a hit, where I hit you, but I just didn't do any damage. You were able to block it with your shield, or you parried it, or the sword stuck in your armor, but it just didn't penetrate, and all that makes it interesting. And you dance around the narration, but at the end of the day, a hit means something happened. Make it look however you want.
Yep.
A miss means something happened. Describe it however you want, and I think it makes it a little bit easier to be descriptive, because when you start going, oh, you did 8 damage, you cut the goblin's neck and there's blood squirting out. Well, how many times can you do that before the goblin's dead? But if you hit the goblin and all you did was, you caused him to twist its ankle as it dodged away, okay, that twisted ankle is 4 points of damage. It doesn't matter.
Exactly. And to feed off of that and what I said on it, how many times can you describe cutting X creature and blood coming out of X part of creature and it still be interesting?
I know one of the times this really hit home for me, we were playing Star Wars. They have minion rules. And I had rolled in something in a way that the way minions work is you do, like, every minion has 4 hit points. So every 4 hit points, you take out more than 1 minion. And I had managed to take out 2 minions. And the GM said, well, how did you manage to do that? And I was like, well, I shot that one in the leg and he fell down and his gun went off and hit the other one. It doesn't matter. All that matters is 2 minions were gone. And I had so much fun describing that, more than I just shot him twice. I shot him and then I shot him. That's boring. So I don't know. So then Jacob follows up. Are you fans of asking your players to provide scene details to add into the atmosphere if you feel a little bit more is needed? So relying on your players at the table.
This is interesting, because I have 2 different answers, which is yes and no.
Okay. I'll take the yes. You take the no.
Okay, so my no is because, again, we just did the GM Masterclass, and we talked a little bit about this in one episode, which is the part, and this is not, I'm going to specify this very clearly, this is not GM advice, this is a Jim McClure style thing. This isn't something that I say is good as a natural thing, but this is part of how I typically run games, which is I have a lot of thought that goes into even the small details of games. We talked about this at the beginning, where you all were placed, where you were giving sleeping arrangements mattered as far as setting a theme that was a through line to an ending duel. If I just go, oh, where were your sleeping arrangements? I'm losing that bit of narrative control. But to do that, it means you are running a super, super tight narrative game. And again, I'm not advocating for that. That's just generally in games like what we did with the GM Masterclass. Those are the type games that I run. So in some aspects, I like to have a lot of control over that, because I can do those little things. However, there are many, many times when I feel like it is completely fine and is a very, very good thing to allow the players to have that sort of buy-in. And because you said you take yes, I'll pass it back to you for that.
I am a huge fan of this. I totally rely on my players a lot for these types of things. But what I would say, especially if you're new at it, is as I say, put a box around it. You're only given the ability to create narratively things that cannot affect your game drastically. I don't care what the name of this tavern is. That is not going to change my story. I don't care if the bartender is a human, an orc, a half-elf, whatever. That's not going to affect my story. In this particular case, it could in another case.
Sure.
Like if there are no half-orcs. But for the most part, I'm only going to say, hey, Jim, tell me about this village that we're walking into. If no matter what you say, it doesn't affect what I'm trying to do. So I put a little box around it. You can't go outside you can't color outside the lines, but you have all the freedom within that. And one little trick I like to say is sometimes I'll say, instead of saying Jim, I'll ask your character, so Uthar, what do you know about this village? And then if you say something that I don't like, well, that was a rumor. You were wrong. You had heard that there was a demi-lich who secretly ran the Thieves Guild here, but that was just a rumor they created because they didn't want people to steal their stuff.
That's a good trick.
So it's a little trick. It's
good
like,
trick.
oh, nope, that's what you thought happened, but you were wrong. But great question.
Great question.
Yes, I really like that. And until we get some more, we will move on.
Yeah, we got
our
plenty still of the
other questions
and
here.
as we figured, yes, long-winded.
Yes. So this was a question, and I'm not going to say the other questions weren't good, but I particularly like this one. You discussed that you had us arrive at the scene separately. So the two crab on one side of the village, we were welcomed pretty open arms. And then the, was it Phoenix? No.
Dragon.
Dragon. I don't know why I said that. The dragon samurai was on the other side of town, did not get a warm reception. And you did that on purpose. Yep. There was a specific reason why. You were trying to establish there's like a power differential. If you didn't want to do that, if you were wanting us to be united, but we didn't start as a group, like you didn't say you all three know each other forever, now you're friends, but if you still wanted us to come together, how would you have done that differently?
Yeah, and we kind of see it in this L5R game if I would have done it a little bit differently. And as you described, Michael, exactly. I did it intentionally for the opposite effect because, again, as we talked about, the plan was it was going to be a PvP duel at the end of this, and that's what I was trying to build towards, which, again, did not end up happening because you all came together too well as a group,
yes.
As it turned out.
As it turned out.
Or just hated Daigochu Jim that much. But it's... if you want to get people working together as a group, you know, this isn't rocket science. You may have heard this before, but the number one thing to do is give them a shared goal. That is the absolute number one thing to get people working together as a team. In this case, you know, again, you all had a shared goal and you all worked very well together as a team because it was a, hey, we have to come in and deliver a fair judgment in a tense political situation. Immediately, the three of you all went, I don't want to say in lockstep with each other because there were some moments of difference, but it was we are a unit working together to make this happen. And having that basic core concept is so vitally important. My advice to people as far as to get people to work together as a group is tell them what the core goal that all the players need to be doing before the first play session. You know, it's what we talked about before the L5R series. You all are going to investigate a land dispute. The three of you are going to make a judgment essentially for one clan or the other or whatever third crazy nonsense you try and come up with. You know, that is your goal. That is your objective. And I am pretty strong on there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It is not railroading to say this game is about you all resolving a land dispute. That's what this game is about. Yeah. And I actually once had a conversation because most of my games I do this. It's a good part of a session zero. This is what the game is about.
Ding, take a drink. Session zero.
Yeah. Do not be scared as a GM to declare what your game is about. You most certainly as part of session zero can like workshop with everyone like, hey, what kind of game are we interested in playing? Right. But I do very much hold to come to a decision. Don't let that just find itself in session one, because while it can work out fine, it also very much, I've seen a lot of people who've run into this situation where it's like, well, this player has no interest on going with them and avenging against the guard captain who is wronging us in jail. They just wanted to go back to the forest. And it's, yeah, because you all have no central goal that you want to do. So I'm big on, I said this to one player once. This was Jim in his not as nicest, but the concept was essentially they came together with a really crazy character concept that was interested in doing something completely different than what the story was about. And I went, I'll make up a name. We'll say Chuck. I went, Chuck, I go, I love the character. I go, we need to set that character aside because that character has no interest in doing what this story is. And we need a character that is. Right. The advice I give is your character gets to decide why they're interested in the main story, not if they're interested in the main story. And that is one of the agreements that I get from my players, again, in a session zero is exactly when that time should be talked about to get everyone on that same page.
Yeah, I, you know, back in my youth when I first started playing games, it was kind of like the trope, the cliche is that you meet in a tavern. You know, you're all in a tavern and the orcs attack and then you all band together and go fight the orcs and that starts how your great adventures. That gets really boring really quick. And it gets really difficult really quick if players have all these disparate goals and ideas that, you know, sure, if it works organically and it works, it's great. But it's hard to make it work. It's hard to get there. So I find it much easier to establish those guidelines ahead of time, I should say. I'm a big fan of the Bond from 5th edition, which I think they stole from Dungeon World, where I do that. And, you know, we'll go around the table. Okay, Jim, how do you know Sarah's character? Sarah, how do you know Todd's character? Todd, how do you know Jeff's character? and we will establish at least some sort of chain where everybody has reason to like at least one other person in the group. And that doesn't mean you're friends. You can still argue, you can still have disagreements, you can still have conflict. But if one of you is captured by orcs, the other ones aren't going to go, oh, well, and then go to town.
Right.
They're going to be like, that Todd's an a-hole, but he owes me 50 gold, so I will go rescue him to at least get my 50 gold. That type of thing.
Exactly, because as long as everyone's moving towards the same goal, and it's great to do. It's honestly, I think one of the best things that Powered by Apocalypse kind of brought into prevalence within gaming is those sort of early bond type things. You start asking those leading questions. I like the ones that are like, okay, I read off my character sheet. What character saved you from a pit trap? Now, all of a sudden, it's like, okay, we have to come up with the story where you actively saved me from a bad situation. Now we're connected. As we play the game, if we're all going towards the same goal, these things are going to naturally occur. We are naturally going to go, God, that Agasha Funakoshi. You know why we're friends? Because I hate him so much.
Yes.
Or
the
it's
enemy of my enemy.
Exactly.
Or the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
And once you all are moving in the right direction again, you're going to naturally have those connections, those bonds, and they're going to build stronger and stronger and stronger. To me, the most important thing is just get everyone moving in the same direction with at least a common goal, and then let the rest play its course on it.
All right, very cool. So here's an interesting question, and I don't remember who asked this one. So apart from L5R and any of the RPGs that you yourself have designed, what RPGs do you find lend themselves to your GMing style?
You did shoot me over this question before, and this is actually the question I had the hardest time coming up with an answer for. This one really made me think, honestly, which I didn't think it would. At face value, I was like, oh, I can come up with a list of games, and I was like, I have to do a little bit of soul searching on this. A lot of games don't lend themselves to my GM style, is the honest to goodness truth. Considering I just gave some love on Powered by the Apocalypse games, now I can give a little hate on them, right? We'll spread it out a little bit. As you all probably noticed, for those that listen to the GM Masterclass series, I have a very interesting GM style, which is I run very narratively tight story structure games. That's what I enjoy, and that's what I enjoy running. And I need a system that will allow me to do that will encourage that kind of a buyback from the players, but will not get in the way of it. And Powered by the Apocalypse has a lot of shared world building concepts to it. I think Powered by the Apocalypse is an amazing game at getting people invested and engaged in Act 1 of a story. But it has problems progressing to Act 2 and 3 because there's constantly tools for players to reset to Act 1. And it's honestly the biggest, which again is not a problem with the system, it is a difference in the style of game I like to run and what Powered by the Apocalypse does. So I tell you the things that get in the way of my GM style to say, really the games that work best for me are the ones that don't get in the way of what I'm trying to do. And the ones that give a nice, rich, lore-filled world for people to engage with. And again, it's why L5R is my favorite. My second best, it's D&D. I really like, honest to goodness, I love the fantasy genre. D&D does not get in the way of anything that I try and do. People understand the tropes. They connect with everything. I really enjoy running Dungeons & Dragons, and I run it very little, seemingly, even though I really enjoy it. So I very much appreciate that question, because I kind of had to think really, really hard about it and realize that I probably should have a better list of games that are good for my GM style as opposed to a list of games that are not good for my GM style. Try and keep it on the positive instead of the negative.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you typically, I can read, curate the types of people that you bring to your table for a particular experience, or do you shape the experience around the people who are at your table?
Yes to both is the answer to that, and it depends entirely on the environment. I do a lot of running games for people for entertainment for them, for the players, I'm going to say, which is to say, if I go to conventions, I like to run games at a lot of conventions. I run games a lot on podcasts, and a lot of times those games are much more geared towards the players that are at the table, which I'm going to show up, I'm going to get as quick of a feeling as I can about what they're interested in, what type of games they like to do, and I'm going to adapt to what they're doing. And I'm a big chameleon GM in that regard. However, and this is why I say yes to both, if it is a home game that I'm playing solely for my own enjoyment, I very highly curate within my friends who will play this type of game because I'm looking for a particular type of experience. Honestly, L5R is one of these games. I've gotten asked this question so many times. For those that have followed me perhaps closely, you notice I never run L5R at conventions, because L5R is close to me. When I run it, I want to run a full-on style of game that I enjoy, and I want to make sure that I've got the proper player buy-in and type for it. I will only run L5R with people that I know.
Unless it's for a podcast.
Well, that was the opening moment, right? You know, to this whole series, and I knew you all, I just didn't know you all yet, right?
Exactly.
But
I mean, we were practically neighbors.
We were. We've told that story numerous times now, but you know, so if I am running a game for my own personal enjoyment, I do curate heavily the players that are going to show up, because my time is getting more and more sparse as I do things like still have a day job and a publishing company and designing games for other people and podcasts and these crazy shows and all of that. My time is sparse, so if I'm playing a game solely for myself, I want to truly enjoy it, and there's a certain type of player that I enjoy playing with. But if I am doing it out in public, and I do a lot of games out in public, and that I'm much more of a chameleon GM and adapting to what they're looking for.
Yeah, and I don't want this to sound derogatory at all, but if you're going to go build a house and you only have so many materials, you need to build a house that fits the materials you have.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a group of players that I play with. They have their strengths and they have their weaknesses, and I have my desires as a GM. So when we play a game, I pretty much know what I can and can't do with that group, or I think I do, and I try to shape the game so that it enhances what they do well and minimizes what I don't think as a group they might do well, or my shortcomings as a DM, that kind of thing. So absolutely, I curate to the table for my home game, but just like you, when I run in a convention, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit more, you know, because I don't know who's going to be there,
right?
And I'll just try to make it work as best I can. So Jacob, also again multi-nodes, asked if you had seen this game before.
Blue Rose.
It is a romantic fantasy game.
I'm thinking Bluebeard's Bride.
Yeah, this version is based off of the Fantasy Age mechanics.
Okay.
But essentially, it is. It's all about relationships. Like the whole game is about having. Have you ever read any of the Mercedes Lackey books?
No.
You should. They're
okay.
Well, they're all the same, so you need to read one of them. But I still really like them. But yeah, basically, it's all about relationships and love and romance. It's romantic fantasy, I think is what it's actually called. So this is probably a game that you might enjoy. The book is gorgeous, by the way.
It looks beautiful.
It's expensive, but you can kill someone with it.
Who put that book out?
Green Ronin.
Oh, did they? Okay.
Yeah.
No, I am not familiar with Blue Rose. I will be the first to say romance is not my genre. Generally speaking, I don't know if that comes across well or not, but I'm not much of a romance genre person, which is a shame actually to myself, because I do love like the interpersonal drama that is around romance is such a good, rich like role play situation for it. I just I don't know. Do I have too much 15-year-old boy in me? Maybe I'm just like, ew, romance at a table.
That could be taken the wrong way. I am not going to comment on that.
You just did.
Sort of. All right. So someone mentions, I love Jim McClure's role playing as story philosophy, and I want to improve my grasp on story structure. Do you have any books that you would recommend I could read to sharpen my understanding? I have already read Hero with 1,000 Faces and am currently reading 36 Dramatic Situations. So do you have any other reading list or any other resources that someone who wants to get more competent with that type of storytelling?
I want to point out reading Pulte's 36 Dramatic Situations is a very, very good thing to read. I just want to really sort of second that as a good reading material. Essentially, the concept is that he posits at the time that he wrote it, which was, I think, 1800 something. I don't know. That there's only 36 dramatic situations that every story is. Now, you most certainly can have a debate as far as whether or not that's true, just like you can have a debate as whether or not there's 8 kinds of fun, which I'm a big proponent of. But the reality is it gives you a format. It gives you a understanding. It gives you a core understanding of here is, story. Here is story structure. Here is at least a good chunk of it to get an understanding. So I would really encourage you to read, and not just the individual 36 dramatic situations, but Pulte's writing around that of essentially what his logic behind everything is a really good read. The other one that I really highly encourage, we actually coincidentally referenced it earlier on this, On Writing by Stephen King.
It's an amazing book.
Yeah, and it is advice that carries over in any medium that you want to write it in. It is just here is a book about how story works, and how to understand how to portray story. Now, again, it's heavily sort of skewed towards the novelization because obviously it's Stephen King, and Stephen King's not known as the world's greatest dungeon master. He's known as a good author, so he didn't write about running tabletop, but that is kind of one of the big ones that I recommend. The other thing that I do want to recommend to you, because I learned, I'm going to say, a lot of my initial stuff not by doing any formal reading or understanding, but I did it with a little exercise, which I wanted to give people, which isn't it isn't a huge thing, but my first big discovery when I was like 8 or 9 years old. Okay, I was watching the Aladdin television show. If anyone remembers the Aladdin TV show, based off of obviously the famous movie, was actually a really good show, or at least I remember it being a really good show. But I discovered story structure through that. I literally had this revelation as a child. It was crazy. I was like, oh, it always starts out, they introduce something that's bad, they go to fix it, it gets worse, and then they beat them. And all of a sudden I started looking, I was like, wait, that's what happens in Scooby-Doo. And all of a sudden, my little 8-9-year-old mind was blown. I was like, this is how stories are.
They've been lying to me this whole time. Burn it all.
I literally went, I know what's going to happen after the commercial break. Like, clearly this is where they have to then get another clue and then solve the thing, which obviously seems, I mean, it's cute and adorable now, but literally it ruined entertainment for me for, well, several years. I mean, 3 to 4 years as a kid seems like forever. And then I watched a show called Gundam Wing and went, whoa, this just ruined all of my expectations. I now love this thing forever. But so my exercise that I tell people is if you want to start understanding story structure, start watching, especially some movies that you're familiar with. Movies are really good because they try and get through that structure pretty darn quickly, and literally watch and go, what is the next scene that's going to happen? And then when it happens, ask, why did they have to do that scene? And suddenly you'll just start seeing all of the dominoes fall into place of like, oh, here is the format, here's where it goes, and you recognize how people set it up, and then you recognize how some of the, then once you get into the really, really great directors, that's why I'm a fan of Tarantino, you watch how they make it familiar and yet subverted at the same time. But that's one of the exercises I encourage you to do is just engage with the stories you regularly do and start going, wait, what is going to happen next? What is the logical thing that's going to happen next within a story progression?
Okay. Yeah, I would agree with that as well. If you just look at a show that you like and ask yourself, why am I watching this scene? Mm-hmm. What happens here that's important? And sometimes it's an action scene. Sometimes it's a character relationship scene. Sometimes it's like a mystery discovery scene. But all the scenes mean something, because otherwise they would have been written, or they would have got cut out on the second draft, or they would have got cut out in editing, because they weren't relevant.
Yep.
So you're seeing what's important to the story and only what's important to the story.
Yep.
So Paget Tish, asks not to get too focused on hindsight,
mm-hmm.
and I want to interject my Michael here, but I think it's important to reflect on past games for learning purposes.
Sure.
Do you think there's anything that you could have done differently to make Daigotsu more sympathetic and actually get it? Because we turned on him pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. And despite some of your best efforts, we never really wavered too much. If you had to do it over again, is there anything you would do differently to try to make it a little bit more equal in those two stacks?
I mean, ultimately, the end of the day, I figured that I figured that obviously Daigotsu Jin was going to be, he's the one who's going to get fingered for being the evil one, and I was okay with that. Making him less evil was, I don't think, ever a desire, and ever a desire I would have wanted to do, because to me the sad, bittersweet ending that I was originally going for is that someone was going to have to duel for him, and I didn't want them to really be necessarily happy about it. I wanted them to feel duty bound to do it. And then when the duel turned to from first blood, where you all thought where it was going to be, to the death, now it's I've agreed to do this. If I back out, my reputation as a samurai, I'm going to be kicked out. I'm done. Like, I can't back out of this thing. I don't want Daigotsu Jin to win, which means I can't win, which means I have to allow myself to die fighting for the villain. That warms my little narrative heart right there. So the only thing I would have liked to done more was essentially something to get someone more willing to be on the side of Daigotsu Jin. And if I wanted to, essentially he could have came with a heavier bargain towards you. I think if he would have perhaps maybe offered to, if you fight for him, I will let your sister free type thing. There may have been something to get you to do it. But of course, with hindsight, it's always terrible to guess, because I go, if we change anything like that, part 2 happens entirely differently. And
right.
I don't want to change part 2. Part 2 was wonderful.
So, again, I'm just playing backseat quarterback or backseat drivers, whatever quarterback. The only thing I could think, and this is just the 12 seconds I had while you were talking, is if you would have had all 3 of us start separately and have me start with him. Mm-hmm. Where he gives me the wakizashi in private, and we have like a moment where he's like, I understand, this happened, I've taken care of you. Because, we were making everything up. So whatever he would have said there would have become truth.
Exactly. But one of the interesting reasons why that couldn't have happened? Because if we remember going back to the first episode, originally it was Morimoto I was going to try to duel for him. Yep.
Yeah, you were supposed to get that time. But again, that's just
hindsight, sure.
Yeah,
yep.
Since I was the character that grew up with them, it would have made sense to put me with them, but that was against what you were trying to do originally. So.
Yep.
So, all right, one more question here from the original. We have a couple more, but this is the last one from the original set of emails. We talked in that first episode about how you knew we didn't really know L5R. Mm-hmm. So that first battle against the Oni was sort of a training wheels, like, let me show you how the game works scenario. Would you have still done that, or how would it have been different if we were already familiar with L5R, or if we were playing a different game like D&D? So, like, what's your first encounter goals if your goals aren't teaching the system, because that's already out of the way?
The first encounter, and again, it is when we look at that combat encounter. So again, this is very specific towards the GM Masterclass series into this. The purpose of that encounter was to do several things. One, as you already mentioned, was to teach combat, because you all had not done it before. If we remove that concept, the combat is still trying to do several other things narratively. It's trying to establish how the river got changed. We had an Oni that was chucking rocks, okay? Bam, we've got it figured out, or we thought we do, and now we had to figure out where the Oni came from and all that nonsense. But it's to establish that, and then ultimately it's to establish relative power level of Daigotsu Jin. We talked about this at the end when James is getting ready to duel him. It's like, oh, wait, his stat's only a 2 or a 3, whatever it was, and there was like I thought he was way more powerful than that. And that's because we establish a relative power level of, okay, he summoned this Oni. This Oni was this strong, or we perceived it to be this strong. Therefore, he must be stronger than that, because that's what makes sense within our brains as far as how we understand story. The big boss is stronger than the mini boss. Like, we understand that. So the concept essentially is those things would have still happened exactly the same, even if you all are familiar with the game. So I still need to establish a big rock-chucking Oni. I still need to establish a relative power level on it. Honest to goodness, if you all are familiar with the system, very little changes in that regards. Now, one of the questions that can come up with that is, okay, because as we talked about it, there wasn't actual mechanics behind them. It was more of a narrative encounter that occurred. What if people are familiar with the game to a certain level of system mastery, where it's okay, we're fighting, an ogre. I know what an ogre is. Right. I know what the stats are. And my easy answer to that is, I shouldn't say easy answer, my personal advice to that is I never want my players thinking that way, so I never run any stats out of the book. And I don't mean to say that I never run creature stats at all, but I regularly grab something. I grab a different, especially when like D&D, I grab a different stat block and I run that like, okay, oh, you're fighting an ogre, and if I want them to be a weak ogre, I'll grab a goblin stat block and just narratively rename whatever the attacks are, and the mechanics are based off of that. So that way, and essentially my regular players have known, like, okay, just never assume whatever Jim creature he threw at us is what we're expecting it to be, because the stats are never going to match. And that way it prevents any of that sort of meta system mastery of, okay, I know this thing is really strong, as opposed to I want you to engage with what's happening around you.
All right, very cool. So once again, to anyone in chat, if you have any questions you would like to ask Jim or myself, they don't have to be related to L5R or to the GM Masterclass. It could be just general GM advice.
I would love to answer questions about the Aladdin TV series.
Or just anything on your mind. We would be happy to try to address them. Until then, we will carry on. So this is from the Discord, our RPG Academy Discord. So I know the handles there. I don't know how they translate to actual names. So this is Waltamides. And he asked about the limited number of NPCs. I know we sort of touched on that already, that you didn't want to have too many because you want us to focus on the ones that you thought were relevant. But he had just mentioned that it felt like when he was listening to it that there wasn't a lot of other people around. Was that intentional? Like, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, to a degree, it's intentional. Because tabletop players are just the worst human beings in the world. Me being one of them. Yeah. Because once you start adding NPCs, and anyone who's GM'd probably more than one game or even one game knows, when you add someone into a story and they're supposed to be irrelevant, the players are going to latch onto them. Yep. I can't tell you how many people, how many NPCs who didn't have a name, who were stacking books in a library, ended up in the adventuring party. Like, it's just what happens.
Yep.
This is a story designed to be a very interpersonal story. Again, ultimately, the ending duel that was in my mind, I just described it a few minutes ago, was two people fighting, both on a side they weren't necessarily feeling good in, tricked to the point where one was going to have to kill the other, and it wasn't going to be a great feel-good moment. That's what I was working towards. What matters to get to that point? If it doesn't matter to get to that point, it wasn't in the story. And that's how I GM in that aspect to it. So I didn't put a lot of needless NPCs. There were actually, I think maybe we talked about this in the match class a little bit. There was the Maho Tsukai, the blood speaker who actually summoned the Oni, was in the spider camp originally planned, but you all did no investigation in there, so they just never came up, and they weren't needed. It wasn't a thing that needed to occur. So I bring in essentially the relevance that's needed for the story that's trying to be told. If you listen to part 2 as we get into it, you'll notice that is a different story that has a different meaning to it, and suddenly there was a lot of different NPCs running around doing a lot of different things that not even always the players knew what they were doing.
Yes. So the thing, I would just to jump in there, I think that is 100% this is a medium for players that has become a medium for an audience. Because as players, that never even crossed my mind. But I think I can see as an audience, like listening, you might be like, there's not a lot of description of other people. I don't think anyone would have thought of that at all who were playing. It's only because it's an audience medium that it became relevant.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that question kind of sparked, because I was like, wait, my first response to it when you sent it to me, I go, what are you talking about? Because in my head here, I go, every time you were walking through the street, I saw all these samurai walking around. I go, it was crowded with people. Like these
was
towns.
That peasant with a camel,
right?
Or no, llama.
Llama. Yes, llama.
Joke. Damn it.
So I see it like it. So the part of it could be a perceptive thing, but there is a truth to it. There are very few other named relevant NPCs outside of the main party, and it's because it's designed to be focused as an interpersonal story. Again, when we get into part 2, you will see there's many more NPCs that are running around doing a bunch of different things on it.
Again, to take you back to popular media, how many TV shows do you watch? There's not a lot of random people. They're in the background. They're at the dinner but it's only the people at the table or the people who come to the table who matter. Everyone else is just background noise. And in an audio medium, sometimes it's hard to get across that it's a bustling city or village around the action that we're doing. So.
It's actually another one of those little wonderful games I play in watching movies, or it's more relevant in TV shows where you have a regular reoccurring cast, is count the number of named characters. So a character that you learn their name within an episode, and quickly you start realizing they're like, oh, there's the one extra person that they meet who you never met before in an episode, and that's about it.
One of the advices I give about NPCs is think of it like a TV show. Like you have bartender, girl at the bar, guy at the police station. Your NPCs can be the same way. You don't need to spend a lot of time coming up with a name and a background for an NPC who probably won't matter.
No, now, they'll drag him into the adventure party.
Those will be the ones that they attach. They go, hey, you come here. But 90% of the NPCs in the world don't need a name or backstory. They're there to serve a purpose. So don't give them any mental power or effort, because you need that for other things.
And I realize we're on a mild side tangent now, but I just in this moment realized why exactly people grab those NPCs that mean nothing. And it's advice that you gave prior on the same thing, Michael, which is the less is more. Like, okay, he's just a guy, stacking books on the library, and he's got, dusty clothes on. Well, wait, what, is he dirty? Was he out in the street? What's like, immediately the mind starts going, what's going on with this person?
Well, it's also the thing of like, why did you mention it?
Yeah.
Because it's such a small, the type of stories that we're telling is if you say something, it must be important. And again, we're getting way off subject.
Right, sure.
One of my things that I love to do is I love to throw out random details that I don't know what they mean, but they might seem important. Like, you notice this person has really vibrant green eyes. I don't know why they have green eyes. They just do. But later, someone else might say, remember that girl with the green eyes? That there must have been something there. Or
as soon as a search for an emerald becomes part of the game, it's like, oh, it must be there's a connection.
Yeah, exactly. So I love throwing out random details just to see what they latch onto, and then trying to make them relevant. And the green eye thing actually legitimately happened.
I assume you're doing a Big Trouble in Little China thing.
No, not this one. They were trying to get into a city. And basically, long story short, someone came up and said, "Hey, I need this in the city. I don't have access to the city. Basically, will you smuggle this in?"
Right.
And they offered them a lot of gold. They didn't have any money, so it was like, sure. And the person they talked to had just super vibrant green eyes, and that's all it was supposed to be. Was just a throwaway NPC, like to show you there's crime and corruption, and to give them a little money. That's all it was for. And then later on in the scene, like different sessions down the road, I guess I'd forgotten that, and I just made up another NPC who happened to have really green eyes. And all the players thought, what's going on?
Connection.
So now it turns out that was a doppelganger
who
was both people, because clearly they were the both people. Yeah, so that totally was not part of the story. But because I said green eyes twice, totally different part of the story. So here's a question from Game Disc, who again is on our Discord. So if you're a fan of the RPG Academy and you're not on our Discord server, shame on you. He asked, and this is directed to me, do you feel that the GM Masterclass has improved your GMing skills, and will you run a dual stacking plot? So this is an interesting question. Let me pause for
face to face, Mike. I can reach out and touch you.
So I'm going to say yes, because I have to,
contractually.
But I think more than anything, listening to your reasonings behind why you do things. Because I don't know that you did a whole lot of stuff that I don't already do, but I may not have done them for the same reasons, or I may have done them without reason, not realizing it's like, oh, okay, so when I did that, I didn't mean to give this impression, but I was. And so just the thought of like thinking through it now, like, okay, so if I want to cause this to happen, here's a way for me to do it. So it's just sort of made me think through some of my tools that, they were in the tool bag. I never used them. Where I might just grope for them, and like, well, this is a good enough hammer here. Now I'm like, oh, that's a planer saw. I know how to use a planer saw now. That's a whatever, because I don't know tools. That's another tool that does the thing that I now know. So I think that's the biggest thing, is just keeping it top of mind. For a lot of the types of games that I run, dual stacking plot doesn't really work, because again, that's a very particular type of story that you're telling. But I could see in like a con game, I might look at trying to do that and seeing if I can get, if I don't want the bad guy to seem so bad, how are some ways that I can do that? And one of the ways is not to worry about making them less bad. Try to make the good guy less
good,
or conflicted.
Yes.
You know, to the point where you're like, I know he's still the bad guy, but this guy's a jerk and an idiot. You know, I want him to commit seppuku because you're a terrible leader, Vegeta.
Yep. And just as a note on that, well, certainly, obviously, anytime you do GM advice, it feels good to be the GM advice person going, oh, I became a better GM listening to you, and I very much enjoy all that praise. You can send that praise to @GM Jim McClure on Twitter. But the reality of it, and I really like the analogy that you used on that, and this is how I personally consume GM advice, is exactly what you described. It's all tools for a toolkit. If I am a plumber, and I went and bought myself, you know, we have a weird analogy here. I went to a GM advice podcast and I learned something, and now I have a new hammer in my tool bag. I don't necessarily say I'm a better plumber, but I do have more tools at my disposal now. And that's really what I look at personally from GM advice, is I go, I've learned plenty of things from, I've learned things from people that are running their first game. I went, oh, they did something in a way that I never thought about, or it engaged in a certain way, and I go, that's a tool for the tool bag. And so hopefully with the GM Masterclass, we talk about a lot of things that, a lot of tools that I feel don't get talked about a lot. So my honest hope would be that it put a couple tools into people's tool bags for it.
Yep, and I would say that it probably did. So here's a question also from Game Disc. And I sort of translated this one. I think I kept the reason behind it, so I apologize if I got it wrong. But I think he was asking, what was the real life time gap between when we played the first series and then when we played the second series, part 2? And I don't remember.
I do know. I do remember. Yep. Because of again other nerd cultures. And actually I can pinpoint it. Oh my god. So the first weekend that we recorded that, it was a WrestleMania weekend. I'm a big WWE fan. I enjoy it. And this was the WrestleMania where Brock Lesnar broke the Undertaker's undefeated streak at WrestleMania. It was a very, very big moment for us WWE fans. So it was that weekend is when it was recorded. I don't know that date off the top of my head, but if you want to do quick Googles, we can tell you the exact date on it. So it was that weekend, so it would have been either the last weekend in March or the first weekend in April. It's always when WrestleMania is. And then we recorded, it would have been mid-November that year. So you've got about 8 months or so in between that first and second game was about the time frame for it.
Okay.
And then, yeah.
And if there were to be a part 3.
If there were to be a part 3.
We're now looking at, what, a 2.5 to 3 year gap?
I think at this point we're about 2.5 years. Is that right?
I think November will be 3 years.
November will be 3 years.
2018. We recorded the first one in 2015.
Yep. Yeah. So November will be 3 years since the second one was recorded. That's correct.
So that might be an interesting thing. So those are all of the pre-questions that we got sent. So once again, we'll go out to our chat audience. If you have any questions for Jim or myself about GM advice or anything in general that you want to talk about, we had scheduled this to go 2 hours, so we still got half an hour, plenty of time. I have some questions for you that I will go to while we're waiting.
Okay.
So I don't want to rehash it all.
Okay.
But probably the most interaction and comments we got was from episode 3.
Yes.
Where we first brought up the concept of fudging dice.
Yes.
Again, we are not going to have that entire conversation.
Oh, really? Because I'm ready for it.
No. We're not going to, because you and I are on the same page.
Sure.
So I don't know that it adds a lot of value because we're just going to keep agreeing with each other. But
I can argue the other side if you want.
Do you want to at least touch on what the counter arguments were from the people who said, you know, I don't do that, or I don't think you should have to do that?
Yeah, and essentially some of the thoughts that came back out, which are completely legitimate and acceptable points. You know, some of this to a degree is personal preference, and some of the concepts that come back from it, and some of the counterpoints to essentially fudging dice, or as it was kind of revealed in this, fudging everything, you know, it was all made up behind the screen, is, you know, at what point can you lose player trust that what's going on is legitimately going on, and that, oh, the rolls just don't matter for anyone, you know, if what's going on behind the screen is all smoke and mirrors, it doesn't feel true, it doesn't feel legitimate. Those seem to be the, you know, some of the core concepts that come as far as the other side of things, which again is a perfect legitimate you know, concern that comes with it. Again, without rehashing the whole conversation, you know, my belief and on the reason I did what I did is because I think that the other side of that conversation, the side that says you shouldn't fudge dice, you shouldn't fudge mechanics and all that, I think they are probably the majority, and I think their voice gets heard the most. And anytime you hear on a forum people go like, oh, no, I fudge die all the time, there's a lot of torches and pitchforks that I've seen. So part of the reason, aside from being very open and honest throughout this whole series that we talked about this, is I wanted to show that the other side works. You can absolutely...
My kids are home. Sorry. I don't know if that's bleeding through the mics or not, but they're upstairs going crazy.
The other side of the, you know, the equation of fudging, again, literally everything, absolutely works to make an interesting dynamic situation for it. And as we talked about before, that should just be another tool in the toolbox. I made reference, I told a story earlier about sort of my moment where I felt like I had leveled up as a GM. That was a moment that was explicitly improved by adhering to the mechanics. We had a player that rolled his damage roll and then had to compare it to his horse that he had saved from several situations and had a very strong emotional bond with, and that was adhering strictly to the rules that told an incredibly powerful moment. Both of those are tools, and both of those are tools that you should be put in the bag. I am personally of the belief that all tools are good and have a purpose. It's understanding when to use them and when to adapt them. I'm never advocating for like, oh, this wrench is better than this wrench, because it's probably factually untrue. It's this wrench fits a certain bolt and this wrench fits a certain bolt, and learn to use them when it's appropriate.
Right. No, I mean, again, I would agree with that. I talk all the time about how I'm completely pro fudging, all that kind of good stuff. But the reality is I don't really fudge that much, because the reality is I don't roll that many dice.
Yeah.
You know, we could play 3 or 4 hours, we might roll a handful of dice total, so it doesn't really come up that often. But what I would say to someone who's new is you need to learn the rules before you break them. You know, if you're an author who's written a bunch of novels like Stephen King, you can do things that kind of violate that structure because you know what you're doing. It's an intentional thing. If you're a virtuoso musician, you can do things that aren't in music theory like what you would teach, but it's going to work because you know what you're doing. But I'm not good at designing encounters. So if I screw up and I say, you know, this is going to be a really fun fight because I'm going to have 3 ogres, and in the 4th round of combat, there's going to be this thing that opens up and we're going to roll a bunch of lava through because that's going to make the, you know, terrain interesting. And I did a bad job, and really 2 ogres would have killed them. Now I got 3 of them here in lava. Then I think it's okay for me to go, okay, well, this ogre only has 7 hit points instead of 14 because I need them to die. And in my opinion, there's no difference between the ogre now has less hit points, or the ogre has more hit points, or there were supposed to be 2 ogres, but now there's only 1 ogre, and rolling a die and going, yep, it's 4. To me, all of those things are exactly the same thing. They're all fudging equal, and I will do any of them. If I feel it's necessary, but it's not for my ego. It's not, no, my bad guy has to get away so he has 1,000 more hit points. It's, this is not going as planned. I screwed up. Let me fix it. Again, going back to the tool analogy, it's a cheat. It's like when you don't line up the joints correctly, so you put a little wood smoother in the middle there, so from a distance it looks like it's connected. But if you inspect it too much, you might notice that it's not actually there.
Yeah, exactly. It's as we've talked about, it is a tool in the toolbox, and it's one to understand and use. And again, I put it on display because it is a tool that works, and I wanted to be able to objectively show, like, I mean, honestly, I'm not going to lie. Being able to reveal that part and talk about it is one of the reasons I was excited about coming on and doing this, because I've been part of some of these long internet forum debates where they just go, no, 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 you're wrong. And being able to go, this is how it worked. And objectively, it worked well. And to be able to point to that is valuable. Again, now what I'm most certainly not advocating is going, never do any mechanics, make it all up behind the screen, because that is just trying to take your 5/16 rents and use it to fix every single problem that you have. And that's not the lesson I wanted people to get out of that. The lesson I want to get people out of it is understand that there is a bunch of different ways to approach things. Understand that, you know, a lot of times we have a lot of built up preconceived notions, and I think a lot of of the pushback on the things like fudging die come from a time period that was not too long ago, which was the GM behind the screen going, aha, and you get hit again for 8 million points of damage.
Right.
I win. I win.
Yeah.
And, you know, or the, you know, you are going to do my story and that's it. And that's why there's a lot of, honestly, there's a lot of pushback to doing heavy narrative structured games like sort of what I run to it, because there's a pushback because there was not too long ago a time period where there was a big prevalent problem with that. My big advice to people is I go, don't throw out good tools just because there's some bad connotations to them. Understand how they work, understand how they're applied. Maybe they will apply to the games that you run, maybe they won't, but here is them being used.
It's like going to a restaurant you've never been to before and get terrible food poisoning, and then someone's like, hey, do you want to go back to that restaurant? No.
Right.
You know, it might be a great restaurant, but the one time it happened to me, it was awful, and I'm just not going to go back there.
Exactly.
And so there, you know, again, other people can go there and have great meals, but not me. So, let me ask you a question here, Jim.
Sure.
I would say most people would agree that that was a very successful game.
I think it was a fun game.
We had fun playing it. We've gotten a lot of accolades from the role play and from the GMing and all that kind of stuff. Can you remember back to that moment when it was over, finally, we had the duel and everybody was like, oh my God, you know, we're all excited and we're talking about this and stuff. How did you feel at that moment? What was your thought or your emotion at that moment?
I think I might have told this semi before. When we got done, I was like, that was a good game. I had fun. I mean, honest to goodness, I'd run better games of L5R with my home group, but we had months to build up stories and all of that. I thought it was a really good game. I wish people could see this, but I think this is unairable in one shot. Was legitimately my thought. And you were there when I told James. I told him after that, I go, you know, ultimately, I go, when you edit it, I was trying to softball. I go, when you edit it through, I go, if it doesn't, you know, if you can't air it, then just don't air it. You know, I go, that's perfectly fine. Because, and again, we talked about it, I had a lot of concerns that this was not the style of game that the one-shot audience was going to enjoy, because everything up until that point, I think that I had listened to, had all been comedy focused. Right. You know, they've done several other serious ones since then, and I was worried it was not going to land well at all. And what I was terrified of was, I was like, I think I ran a pretty good game. And again, I most certainly don't want to take all the credit for it, as we talked about in the series. Like, that game would not have been what it was without the three of you all.
It was everybody.
It was 4 people who all put in 25% each on that game, without question.
Yeah, some of us put in 26.
Not living up to that Silent King moniker, I say. So, you know, it was, but what I was terrified of was that it was going to play, and then there would essentially be crickets, and it would be like, okay, back to the yucks, please.
Right.
You know, type thing. And luckily, James D'Amato was smarter than me in that case, and was like, no, this is good. The audience will love it and all of that. But that was my immediate feeling after, is I was like, I don't think this is airable in one shot.
So let's separate out the one shot.
Okay.
Just from your, I'm a game master, I ran a game, scale 1 to 10. How do you feel you did?
7.
7.
Okay. 7. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you a question here.
Okay.
Okay. And I don't want to get into any details.
Sure.
What score would you give yourself after part 2 of the series?
Oh, Michael.
We're being honest and open, right?
Hitting 5.5.
Okay.
5.5.
So the reason I ask is there has been some discussion between you and I, and between me and the other faculty.
Yep.
We definitely want to do more GM Masterclass. 100% this is something we want to do again. But there was some conversation like, do we really want to go into another L5R game?
Sure.
Do we want to go into another series with the same game master?
Right.
You know, do we want to try to bring in other people? And I was leaning that way. I was really thinking, you know, maybe we should bring in a D&D game or whatever. You know, we could change it up. But someone was asking some questions, and it got me thinking. So I went back and I re-listened to part 2. And I recalled some of the conversation you and I had after part 2. And I personally feel that the conversation around part 2 will be drastically different.
Very different.
Than part 1, because we viewed part 1 as a success. And from a GM standpoint, you sort of viewed part 2 as a failure.
Yeah.
It was not up to your standards.
I've never, I know for a fact, I've never stated this on the mics. We've had conversations after this. I think part 2 suffered from not total abject failure, but abject failure of the GM, of course, myself, who ran that. There are some really good lessons to be learned from that.
Right.
And a lot of the core abject failure came from it's the counter side to running a structured story. I was too committed to my structured story in part 2. There was a couple scenes that I wanted to happen, solely because I was in a very interesting, God, this is so weird to say. I was in a very interesting emotional time because this happened directly after we learned L5R was getting sold to Fantasy Flight, like within a month or two after that came out. And I was in an odd place with L5R in my mind, and there was a couple scenes that I wanted to occur because they were going to parallel my experience with L5R in a meta way. And I wanted those things to occur too badly, and I didn't allow myself to go with what the players were doing and flow with that in a certain way. I still think we ended up with some amazing good moments out of that series. I'm still very, very happy with it at the end of the day. But that was a series where the players were fully on board with what was going on, fully engaged with the story, and the GM was not responding to the players' actions. And that's where I state my abject failure as a GM in part 2. And when and if we do that, that is most certainly something we will open up and discuss.
So, and that is why I have decided, as long as you're on board, I do want to do part 2 next.
Okay.
I want to move directly into that to be the next series, which again, there's a good chance it may be weeks or months before we can record, maybe weeks or months before we actually release. So it's going to be some time, but that is going to be the next series, because I do think this isn't just going to be the same lessons over and over again. It's going to be, in the first series, it worked. Here's why it's worked. Second's going to be like, it didn't work.
Right.
Here's why it didn't work, and here's how I recovered or how I tried to recover.
Right.
And I think that is going to be very valuable, possibly humbling.
Yes, it's an interesting. It's an interesting tale that will be told.
Yes, and we're not going to get into all of it now, but there was some editing.
Yes,
magic
there was.
that happened to make that game a little different.
There was.
Yeah, but we'll get into that sort of, because I can be more interesting in context.
Yeah.
So we'll get to there. But so those are all the questions I have. So we'll go one more time to the audience. If you have any questions for Jim or myself, please answer. Jim, I'll ask you, do you have any questions?
I have, I do have from the player perspective of the game. One of the things I was most curious about is, what were your expectations coming into that game? Because again, we had some conversation beforehand. Obviously, you were very familiar with the One Shot podcast before, and again, their typical environment, and then again, me coming like, hey, we're going to run a serious game. What were your expectations going into that game of what you thought you were going to play, I guess?
To me, it's funny. I was terrified.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, when we talk about in the series, I had a podcast, had some listenership, nowhere near what One Shot had. Here's an opportunity for me to be on that show, to represent my show, hopefully get a bunch of people to start listening to our show. So I wanted to make sure I did a good job. So I was really, really focused on making sure that I came to the table and role played well. I wanted to represent my, the RPG Academy. We also drove, I think, like 5-6 hours to a city I'd never been to before. I met James for the first time in person. I was sleeping on his couch. There was a lot of crazy stuff happening all around this game. And it's a game system I had never played before. And again, I've said it before, I think I'm a funny guy. I think, I got some one-liners, I got some zingers, I got some dad jokes. I can get people to laugh around the table. And then you're like, this is a serious game. And I just kept thinking, like, fudge. Like, my one thing that I think, it's One Shot. I can be funny on One Shot. And I still was.
you llamas? Llamas.
Someone give me a llama. So that's that's what I do all the time when I play D&D. It's just nonstop zinger type of things. I'm a terrible player. I would hate myself as a player. So I didn't have a whole lot of expectations. I just had fear that I was going to represent myself poorly. And I still cannot to this day listen to that episode and not yell at myself, it's Daigatsu Jin, Daigatsu Jin, Daigatsu Jin. I said his
Daigatsu.
name. Daigatsu. Yeah. Oh my God, it drives me crazy when I hear myself. And, and also just even my mic presence. I was timid. I was a lot quieter, and some of it was like we were trying to role play, you know, like, you know, calm. But I don't like the way I sound on the podcast. I like the choices I made. I don't know that I, you know, lived that character as much as I would have liked to in that first series.
What about the second series?
I was a lot more comfortable.
Everyone was much more comfortable.
I was a lot more comfortable. And there's definitely some things that I want to talk about in that.
Okay, yeah, no spoilers.
But I will say that there was also some nervousness because the first series was so well received. I thought, here's our chance to, you know, capitalize on that. I'm a lot more comfortable now. I've been doing it longer. I'm the one editing it, so I have a lot more control, and I can just I can edit Daigotsu and just put that in every time if I need to. And then Kat, who I never met because she wasn't there the first time, she got edited, and it definitely changed the dynamic. And I think that is some of the conversation I want to have, is how having her there changed things a lot. But yeah, I wasn't scared or nervous at all then. I just wanted to have a fun game, and I think we had a fun game.
Oh, we definitely had a fun game.
But yeah, there's I think I'm interested in getting into that. But anything else?
No, I think that was it, and hopefully, say for those that listen and follow through the whole series with us, you know, listening to the original podcast, obviously part 2 that we did, then this GM Masterclass and this live show. You know, my hope is always that, you know, it was entertaining and educational. You know, hopefully that it was a good experience for you all. Again, we'll let you enjoy the hobby even more than what you did before, and again, if it puts a couple extra tools in the tool bag, then we've done our job, and we'll move on to part 2.
Fantastic, Jim. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for all your time, all the hours and hours you spend in my basement. Thank you to everyone watching and listening now, and to anyone who listens in the future. Hopefully, if this was your first experience with the RPG Academy because you came to us from Jim, coming through the One Shot Podcast Network, please check out some of our other shows. I think they're all quality in their own way. And we all are also part of the RPG Academy Network. So there are a bunch of other shows that also will give you different avenues and insight into gaming, and also some just really good actual plays that do some really cool stuff. So hopefully you'll check that out. And again, join our Discord server. I love having that thing now because people talk all the time, and it's just like my phone buzzes at work all day, and I just need that interaction. So until next time, this has been Michael.
This has been Jim.
And I screwed up again.
Really? I thought we did that good live.
No, because I did until next time. I was supposed to say that later. So I was say, so thank you. And this has been Michael.
This has been Jim.
And we will see you next time. And then we do the awkward wave.
And then we do the awkward wave.